Everybody, thanks for tuning into the Vanguard podcast. I'm Zac.
And I'm Gavin.
And today we are super excited to be joined by Dave Zirin, the sports editor of The Nation, host of the Edge of Sports podcast, and author of upcoming book, The Kaepernick Effect. Also author of a number of other books surrounding the impact, the legacy, and the political importance, and just the mammoth figure that was Muhammad Ali, arguably the most famous man of the 20th century. And one of the most important political figures to really transcend every element of life, whether that was sports, celebrity, politics, and somebody that we can learn so much from. Dave, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, I love being here. Love the subject matter. Love that you pronounce my name right. So we're batting 3 for 3.
Hey, man. Well, the least I could do.
Yeah, we're super excited to chat with you.
Awesome. Thank you. And I love your fuck around and find out flag behind you.
Thanks so much, man. Thanks so much. We really appreciate it. And
so as we dive into Ali and his legacy, and as Gavin kind of mentioned, we're a typical straightforward lefty podcast. I love boxing. I love combat sports. I get off into the deep water sometimes, and our chat kind of, reprimands me for it a little bit. But frankly, it seems like most lefties aren't sports people, or at least the lefties with large platforms aren't sports people, right? Noam Chomsky famously said the point of sports is training in irrational jingoism, right? Not exactly a sales pitch. And you've argued extremely elegantly that by speaking out for the soul of the sports that we love, we do more than just build a fighting left that stands for social justice in every arena. We also begin to impose our own ideas on the world of sports and provide a counter morality to compete with the yawning hypocrisy of professional sports leagues. And to me, that just screams like a description of Muhammad Ali, somebody who embodied that exact opportunity when he was the heavyweight champion of the world. He was arguably the most famous man on earth, certainly the most famous black man, and he wielded that power to a degree that nobody could have ever foreseen. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the importance of that and why we need to see more of that in sports.
Well, let's start with Ali. I think the most important thing to remember about Muhammad Ali is that he didn't come down from planet awesome with all of these formed ideas in his head, ready to shake up the world. And I think that's important because I've always used Ali as a way to teach about how struggle changes individuals, and then how individuals can then turn around and alter the course and history of struggle. And I think that's so important because we put in our society, the ancient Greeks didn't do this, but U.S. society absolutely puts heroes up on pedestals. And I think there's something very destructive about doing that because it makes it seem like, oh, well, I could never be that person. I could never be like them. And while maybe it's true that maybe the three of us, even all combined, could never have knocked out Sonny Liston, there is some truth to that. But there's not truth that nobody could ever possibly do what Ali did. No, because at the base level, what Ali did was stand on principle and stand with the oppressed against oppressor nations and stand with oppressed people in the United States. And that's something all of us can do. So being like Ali doesn't mean the ability to knock somebody unconscious. It doesn't mean having that incredible gift of gab. It doesn't mean being so physically beautiful. What it does mean is being able to stand on political principle. So when I talk about Ali, the first thing I always try to remind folks is read about his life and read about his biography. Because if you do that, you see that in 1960, Muhammad Ali was an 18-year-old named Cassius Clay, whose dream in life was to win an Olympic gold medal for the glory of the United States and to bring the showmanship of professional wrestling into boxing. And if you'd asked him who his hero was, he never would have said somebody like Malcolm X. His heroes were people like Gorgeous George Wagner, who was a famous professional wrestler, and who was white and blonde. And Gorgeous George, what he was so known for was his ability to make crowds so angry and enraged that they would buy money to see him get beat up. And that's what Cassius Clay wanted to bring into the world of boxing, that sense of gab and showmanship that would get people buying tickets.
Basically being a heel.
Yes, exactly, to use pro wrestling parlance. He wanted to be the ultimate heel. And he had an instinct for knowing what would get under an audience's skin. And when I say an audience, I don't just mean a white audience, but also older black audiences that had been raised on boxers like Joe Louis and had certain ideas about what a champion should be, particularly a black champion. Like there was this idea in the black press that a black champion had an extra responsibility to, not be loudmouthed, to not be outspoken, to not be photographed late at night at clubs, all of these things. And although that's a whole other question, we can get to that in a second, that was something that Ali also never did, but the black press still didn't like him because he didn't do so because he was informed by the politics of the Nation of Islam, which would not have you consorting with white women and being at clubs at 2:00 in the morning drinking alcohol. So, and Malcolm X once commented on that very archly, saying, "I don't understand why everybody hates Cassius. He's the all-American boy. Look at him. He doesn't drink. He doesn't swear. He's the all-American boy." But of course, Malcolm is saying this with a twinkle in his eye because he knows why they don't like Cassius, because he was calling white people devils and saying he was going to join the Nation of Islam. So, but I'm running far afield. The main point is so Cassius Clay wants to bring pro wrestling into boxing, and he only becomes Muhammad Ali because the 1960s intersected with his life. If the same person comes out of Louisville, Kentucky in 1950 or 1940, 1930, you don't get Muhammad Ali. You only get him because of the intervention of the Black freedom struggle and the anti-war movement. And that's where he's so important historically, whether you're a boxing fan or not, whether you're a sports fan or not, is that people, if you know the history of the 60s, you know that these movements that so defined the decade and so I think define our times to this day, the anti-war movement and the Black freedom struggle, that in the first half of the 60s, they really did exist on parallel tracks. The anti-war movement was largely white and college-based. And of course, the Black freedom struggle was a movement that centered around, at that point, going into the mid-60s, in Black urban areas, like out of the South and into Black urban areas. But in Muhammad Ali, all of a sudden, you have someone who has one foot in each camp. Somebody who, by 1967, is known as the most famous draft resistor in the history of Earth, and as somebody who reflected for a lot of people, particularly Black and white youth in this country, their impatience with Dr. King's strategy of fighting Jim Crow in the South. And so he represented the impatience of the new generation of Black freedom fighters, and he represented people who were fighting against this war in Vietnam. And he was making those connections too. He would say things like, "Why should I go fight in Southeast Asia and Vietnam while Black people in Louisville are treated like dogs?" So here's Muhammad Ali before Martin Luther King ever did it, so famously as he did in his Riverside speech in 1967. Here's Muhammad Ali bringing those worlds together of fighting racism at home and fighting racist imperial war abroad.
Well, one of the things I actually learned from reading you, Dave, was that MLK actually quoted Muhammad Ali when he came out against the Vietnam War. When he spoke out against the Vietnam War, he said, he used Muhammad Ali's words as like a reinforcement. I believe you said it for the public, and how that would just be unheard of today for somebody to do that with LeBron or any other kind of sports figure, regardless of how talented or well loved they are.
Yeah, and there are other folks too. Nelson Mandela said upon his release, one of the first people Mandela visited when he came to the United States upon his release from Robben Island was Muhammad Ali. People should Google those pictures online. I mean, Mandela looks so happy to be meeting Muhammad Ali after 27 years in prison. And Mandela would tell stories about, in this incredibly brutal prison on Robben Island, being, passed notes about the latest news for Ali and his fights. Mandela had been a boxer himself. And Mandela has some quote where he said, when Ali threw his punches, it felt like the walls were coming down around me. So for people to say that, he was just a boxer or that his influence is exaggerated, there's actually a whole terrible book that I'm not even going to give the title of it, that its entire thesis is that the myth of Muhammad Ali is something that's just sort of conjured by, leftists like myself as a way to say, oh, look, sports, politics, the left, it's all connected. And it's all an exaggerated kind of sham. But when you look at people like Dr. King referencing Ali, when you look at, of course, Malcolm X and Ali and their relationship, when you look at Mandela, when you look at the Native American movement in this country and what Ali did with them, when you look at the Palestinian refugee camps that Muhammad Ali visited, and you look at what he used his fame to shed light upon, in this world. I mean, it's a remarkable story, one that certainly has been whitewashed, much more so than this idea of the left holding it up so Ali is somebody other than he is. I think his story far is like the opposite of that we don't know the actual true history of everything that he represented to so many people. And I will say this, like, I was nervous before going to the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky. It actually does a pretty amazing job at cataloging all the ways in which he stood with oppressed people, with a series of incredible photographs by a famed photographer named Howard Bingham, who followed him around, there's also an exhibit of Bingham's civil rights photos, and they're amazing. I guess that's my way of saying that if you're ever in Louisville, I mean, or if you're ever, frankly, in the United States, this is bucket list stuff. Go to the Ali Center in Louisville, and you can see the true breadth of what he represented to so many.
Yeah, well, that's super interesting, and we'll definitely check that out if we're ever in Louisville for sure. You've talked about how it hurt to see Bill Clinton, however, at Muhammad Ali's funeral in 2016. You said, given Muhammad Ali's historic place as a great figure against war and against bigotry, to have the person who signed the welfare bill, the person who signed the crime bill, the person who was in charge of the sanctions of Iraq, it was painful to see him up there, or will be rather. Now, however, the president.
Can I come in real quick? I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I'm smiling, and you told me this is video, and I think I just got to explain why I involuntarily smiled from ear to ear, because it wasn't painful to see Bill Clinton at his funeral. It was actually kind of amusing because he looked so uncomfortable, because so many of the speakers spoke out for things like Palestinian rights and the welfare state. I mean, the funeral was like a rally, and Bill Clinton looked super uncomfortable and gave, frankly, the weakest speech of everybody who was up there. That's actually a fond memory.
Yeah, that's not surprising.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. Thanks for the context. Well, what I was going to say is that it just reminds me of a problem that I feel the left is facing now. Of course, our president is Joe Biden, and he's the leader of the Democratic Party. And he, of course, wrote the crime bill that Clinton signed. And then there seems to be little reckoning with this uncomfortable nature of this fact, and little to no willingness to call it out in elite liberal circles. In the tradition of Ali's unwavering resistance to bigotry and imperialism, do you believe it's incumbent on modern day civil rights icons, people such as Colin Kaepernick, to speak out even more loudly against the evils perpetuated by both political parties in this country, currently manifesting most outrageously in Joe Biden's refusal to address police reform, his refusal to federally legalize cannabis, to address mass incarceration or crack down on private prisons, and of course his unwavering support of and continued funding of imperialist projects abroad, including what's continually going on in Palestine. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if you think there's adequate resistance from the modern day Muhammad Ali's.
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, I believe very strongly that it's incumbent on people to do exactly what you're talking about. It's incumbent on me to do it. It's incumbent on you to do it through your pod. It's incumbent on me to do it through whatever outlets I have. Is it incumbent on someone like Colin Kaepernick to do it? I tend not to like to put the weight on the individual to make stances like that if they're not ready to do it or if they don't feel comfortable doing it, largely because I'm not sure it helps. But also, I know that Ali only spoke out because you had these mass movements that, frankly, took direct aim at the Democratic Party around the issue of Vietnam, which was, remember, Lyndon Johnson's war at the time Ali was opposing it. And of course, in the case of the Black freedom struggle, you're dealing with Southern Democrats in a lot of cases. Up in the urban centers as well, your big city Democratic mayors. I mean, it was a time, of course, of great political flux in the 1960s in terms of where everybody stood. I think if there were similar movements right now, I would say, like, the people who've inspired us to get to this point need to speak out. But I think step one is we got to build the struggle. So there's this context for these athletes to speak out. I mean, I think you saw so many athletes, for example, speak out around Black Lives Matter, not because they didn't believe that before 2020.
That's kind of what I'm getting to. I feel like, someone like Kaepernick has done so much work in elevating the cause of Black Lives Matter. And I feel like he could really take the cause of, say, Palestinian liberation to the next step by, adding his voice to that chorus and connecting the dots for people that, oh, this is a related issue. Black lives matter just like Palestinian lives matter, and this is a related struggle. I believe even Nelson Mandela said, South Africa isn't free until Palestine is. So I guess I just worry a little bit that there's these great causes, Black Lives Matter, etc. But when it comes to the actual people that are currently in power, currently perpetuating these systems of inequality and injustice, people like Joe Biden, who have historically and presently are continuing the drug war and the project of mass incarceration and imperialism, they're not connecting the dots that it's like, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but this guy's also part of the problem. It's not just the Donald Trumps of the world. And I just worry that sometimes
some people are connecting the dots. Kyrie Irving did a press conference recently where he spoke about this, and I was actually impressed with the number of pro athletes, not just in the U.S. but around the world, that put forward statements in solidarity with the Palestinian people during the last go around, because that has been, as someone who's worked on that issue for half my life, I mean, that has been a very, very difficult nut to crack, to get people to make the very connections that you're talking about. And I think that's what creates the context. The more people who do things like that, the more frankly, we connect Black Lives Matter politics with Palestine, which Angela Davis has done. Certainly, her book "Freedom is a Constant Struggle." I mean, it's quite common parlance in the movement to make those kinds of connections, which is a good thing and a positive development, and frankly, a world historic development, given where we're coming from. And I think that's our task. And the more we do that, the more likely we're going to see people far more famous than Kyrie Irving, who are in the athletic world, step up and do the same. But that's where we're at right now. I'm not sure. I don't have a lot of hope in seeing some of these big athletes do things like that in a vacuum, though, without the movement itself, because even Ali needed the movement, and he was somebody who certainly was fearless and willing to stand up whenever.
Do you think there's any issue at all with people like Colin Kaepernick cozying up to multinational $1 million corporations like Disney and Nike? Or do you think that at all would influence his ability to speak out on those issues? And do you think there's an equivalent back in the day of Ali? Do you think he was similarly binded by contracts with giant corporations that may have had interest that are alternative to his speech? Or do you think there's any sort of equivalency, or no?
Well, there wasn't for Ali in the 60s, because he was, as one GM put it, not GM, he was one of the leading promoters in the world at the time, a guy named Bob Arum, called Ali a dead piece of merchandise. So that provided him a degree of freedom, because he didn't have this kind of this corporate backing.
Yeah, because he was managed by the Nation of Islam. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah,
he was managed by the Nation, which was at times not an altogether altruistic operation by the Nation, to be very clear, but it did provide him space to
basically nowhere in boxing is altruistic, though. I feel like it should be noted for the
yes. There's a great book that I just finished. It's just funny you said that, called The Devil and Sonny Liston. And if nothing else, it'll make people feel sympathy for the rock and the hard place that exists in this all too dirty part of the world. But I think that when it comes to modern athletes, I mean, I've met Colin Kaepernick. I've talked to Colin Kaepernick. I do not think that his connection to any kind of corporation actually serves to silence him. And I think one of the reasons why he's made some of these corporate partnerships is precisely because he can't work in the NFL.
Yeah.
I mean, they've put him in this position where, we live in a capitalist society, and he's in the position where he has to sell his brand because he can't sell his skills, because a sector of capital has decided that he's not allowed to sell his skills because of his political beliefs.
Yeah, that I'm certainly sympathetic to, for sure.
That's where we're at.
One thing that I think feeds well into this is something that you've said, and you mentioned the zeitgeist of the time being so influential, and being how Ali was both a product and an influence of his times, right? He both reacted and molded the time. And you also said on multiple occasions, I believe, that it's wrong to understand Ali as a Malcolm X that could throw a right hook or a left hook or whatever. Yeah. Could you talk about why that is, and how Malcolm X is a very different man than Muhammad Ali was, even though both of them were massively important and massively connected and on the same wavelength on a lot of issues at the same time. but both of them obviously had that connection to the writing of Marcus Garvey, this idea of complete Black liberation, Black power, Black is beautiful, these kinds of things. But he's a very different man. He was an athlete and not as much of maybe a scholar as
it's just about people having because sometimes in our society, an icon is an icon is an icon. And so all icons are treated equally because there's no historical depth or nuance to any of the discussions that we have. And so the line I say, and I use it a lot because someone who was a contemporary of Ali said it to me, said the biggest mistake that you could make in understanding Ali is looking at him as like Malcolm X with a good jab, or Malcolm X with a left hook. Because, Malcolm X was this incredibly learned figure who'd been on the scene for 15 years of intense study and debate on a daily basis, and organizing too. Malcolm X was an organizer, a street level organizer, and he organized mosques around the country. And he was by far the most successful organizer that the Nation of Islam had ever had. And so here's Malcolm X with all of his experience and book knowledge and organizing experience. And he brings, and he becomes completely entranced, really, like absolutely, like all of us were, with this 20-year-old boxer who had this incredible gift of gab and kind of a gut instinct that was probably passed on conversationally from his father, who was influenced by Garvey. But Malcolm X's father was a Garvey organizer. Muhammad's father was much more of somebody who read the literature and had a sense of feeling very wronged by racism in society, frustrated in his own ambitions. It's much more of that. And so but what that means though is that Muhammad Ali is going to get things wrong politically. And just because he gets them wrong, so he's not perfect. He's not Malcolm. He gets things wrong. But just the fact that he gets things wrong doesn't negate what he did right. He was an athlete responding to what was happening around him. There are many different Alis, and you see this in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. There's not like a steady consistency of this is my political core and this is who I am. Now, some of that, of course, has to do with Parkinson's and brain damage, and that cannot be put aside blithely. But I've had people ask me all the time, sometimes, this is like in a college campus situation where somebody can be very confrontational, where they'll say, if Ali is so great, why did he, do fights, for Ferdinand Marcos, who is a brutal dictator, or Mobutu Sese Seko, who's a brutal dictator? And it's like, would I have made that choice? No. Would Malcolm X have made that choice? No. Would a bankrupt boxer who's being offered $10 million a year make that choice? Sure. That's the world in which we live. And and I think just us being aware of some of those realities of who this is, how much study and debate he'd been able to have before being thrust into the global spotlight, all of those things were very important because, Malcolm X wasn't born, Malcolm X was made. And, he self-forged his own intellect and his own skills. And he did it during a time, during a set of years that Ali obviously did not have.
Yeah. I think that that's one of the things I really wanted to talk about was how Ali has completely transcended all of this politics, right? So I grew up, my family's from Louisville, Kentucky. My grandfather grew up in the projects of Kentucky. The old Polston folklore is that my great aunt Nancy went on a date with then the Louisville Lip. He wanted a stuffed monkey. She was white, he was black, he was like 20. In Louisville, she was a stripper, by the way, so it was not necessarily like a romantic date, but anyway. My grandfather has loved Muhammad Ali my entire life, instilled that love in my father, and me as well. He has a Christmas tree ornament of Muhammad Ali that goes up every year. I mean, this is it was the biggest hero to him growing up as a kid in the projects in Kentucky at that time period, right? And that being said, this is still a man who I disagree on probably every single political issue with, right? Like, he's my grandfather, I love him, blah, but he's a Trump guy. Like, we don't agree on anything that would be considered remotely political for the most part. And yet he still has this visceral connection to Muhammad Ali. And I feel like that sentiment is shared so much by so many people. And I'm wondering what's lost by that, this and why does that happen? You wrote this amazing piece for the LA Times after Muhammad Ali died, don't remember Muhammad Ali as a sanctified sports hero, right? He was a powerful, dangerous political force. He, put his money where his mouth was so many times. He was staring down years in prison. He, gave up the prime of his athletic career. You've made the point, and many people have, he would have never served in Vietnam. He gave it all up as a show of his principles. But that's not remembered as much as him just being the greatest, about him being, somebody that, moved like a butterfly, stings like a bee. Or, you know what I'm saying? And what's won and what's lost by that?
Well, I'm going to half answer your question by giving my own story when I was in Louisville. And I've told this story, and sometimes people think I'm not telling the truth because it sounds cinematic, but I give you my word this is true. I get in a cab at the airport to go to the Ali Center. And the guy who picks me up has all of this white dude with all of this regalia from his years as a Vietnam War sniper all throughout his cab. So much so that I had to be like, whoa, lot of stuff in your cab from your time in Vietnam, huh? And he's just like, yeah. And he goes on this very racist rant about how much he loved killing Vietnamese people. It was really ugly. And about all the great things about his time as a sniper. And I said, well, sir, I mean, I gave you my address. I'm going to the Ali Center. There's a street in town named after Muhammad Ali. I have to ask, what must you think of him? And then after saying all this stuff about his time as a sniper, he says, oh, I love Ali. And I say, really? That's surprising. And he says to me, and I say, why? And he said, because he was brave and he wasn't full of shit. And it's interesting. Like, I think I didn't get into the politics of the actual Vietnam War with this sniper. He just liked being a sniper. I wasn't like, do you think we could have won the war? Or, should we have extended the war into China? I didn't get into that or anything with him. Partly because he was a little bit scary. So I didn't go too deep. But I do find it, I think one of the things about Ali is that he was deemed to be correct on two huge historical questions. That of, are we going to live in a multiracial democracy, or are we going to live in a Jim Crow apartheid society going forward? Obviously, that question has not been answered. And but that question seemed to be answered by the 1970s. And then the other question is, was it right to be in Vietnam? And he was in a minority, and then he was in the majority. He goes from being bugged by Richard Nixon and the FBI to being invited to Gerald Ford's White House. So he goes from being this figure of polarization to this figure of reconciliation. And I think that that's what a lot of people respond to. They like the idea of the Ali who is this figure of reconciliation. And it was something that it was easy for the people who surrounded Muhammad Ali in the 80s and 90s and aughts to have him play into that narrative precisely because he'd lost the power of speech. And it made it difficult, of course, for him. I mean, he was able to do some things during those decades, like it was in the early 90s when he visited a Palestinian refugee camp, for example. But
in Lebanon.
Yes, that's right. But trips like that became more and more onerous the more sick he got. I mean, he had trouble staying awake for hours at a time, throughout the day, and then sleep at night. It was very incredibly sad. And this was something a lot of people have made this point. But, the Ali that America, really white America, embraced was the Ali who'd lost the power of speech. And so I think what I've tried to do, what obviously you guys are trying to do through this pod, is remind people of the other Ali, the Ali who didn't have his political teeth removed. But there, to me, is also something nuanced and very strong about people like this sniper in the cab, who sees Ali as being brave because Ali was right on the question of the war. And I think that's part also of why he was seen as this figure of reconciliation, not merely because he abandoned the radical politics of the 1960s, which is what some people say.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I wonder how much of it is the fact that like that guy said, you know, he was brave and, you know, I'm sorry, what was the other?
Oh, and he wasn't full of shit.
Wasn't full of shit. Exactly. It kind of reminds me of exactly like a moment I had with my own father, who again, you know, Republican from, you know, lives in Kansas City, but you know, we both bonded over Rage Against the Machine, who for political reasons I've always been really attracted to, but I was also like, Dad, why are you into this? And he's like, I respect anybody that has the balls to say what the fuck is on their mind. And I think that for a lot of Americans, that's enough, and that they don't think too much deeper about an individual than that. And yeah, I just hope that we can force people to, because Ali was so much more than that. And I wanted to get a little deeper into, we've touched on it a few times, his strong support for Palestine. Obviously, you know, Muhammad Ali is among the most famous Muslims who's ever lived, probably. He's one of the most famous people who's ever lived. You know, he famously called the United States a stronghold of Zionism and imperialism from Lebanon at a time when that was just completely like political heretics, right? I mean, he was slandered, shamed. I mean, it cost him so much. And he, you know, negotiated with Saddam Hussein and tried to free political prisoners. I mean, this is a man who was just as much of a diplomat as he was a pugilist. And I just wondered if you had any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, also have this great picture of him attending this Free Palestine rally in the 80s in Chicago. That's really this beautiful picture of him with sunglasses, you know, just blended in the crowd next to a father whose child is on his shoulders. And the child actually has is wearing a keffiyeh and has a toy Uzi and is right next to Muhammad Ali. And I'm like, whoa, that kind of photo would get somebody canceled today, to use the parlance of our times here. But there's not much more to say. I think you said it really well. I think what's important to remember is that, you know, Muhammad Ali, his compass was the oppressed and non-white people of the world. That was his compass. So, but not exclusively. Non-white is sort of an odd way to put it, because he had sympathies for people in Belfast, the IRA. I mean, it really was looking at issues of oppression.
Yeah, he was just as concerned with the poor. Yeah.
Yes, just as concerned. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's like, who's standing on whose neck is really the question. And he knew which side he was on at each and every time. And I think the part about Israel is so important because, you know, where I live, certainly, there are a lot of people I would describe as being what we call the PEP squad, you know, progressive except for Palestine. So they'll talk this big game about being on the side of oppressed peoples, and they'll check off their list of everybody who they stand with. And then Palestinians are just like conveniently left off the list. And it's something that's just simply wrong. And I think that's part of the Ali legacy, though, is like this complete panorama of this question of which side are you on, and he knew which side he was on.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that the reason why a lot of those like PEP squad people, as you said, refuse to wade into the issue is because it's those people that cannot stand the idea of having any accusation thrown at them of bigotry, which of course is the first defense from people that want to defend Israel, just accuse critics of being anti-Semitic. And a lot of these so-called progressives, you know, it's really more about virtue signaling than about actually standing up to the powerful and the oppressors. And they just can't stand, you know, the thought of having that label thrown at them in a pejorative way, even if it's not accurate at all. They don't want to go out on a limb and actually defend the reality of what's going on and their stance on it.
I think that's the number one reason, without question. I think the second reason is the Democratic Party. And, you know, and people, a lot of these folks who are against oppression, they also see themselves as good left Democrats. Yeah. And part of being a good left Democrat, at least until recent years, has meant uncritically supporting Israel. I think one of the remarkable developments of the last several months is seeing even this small section of the Democratic Party break away and speak about apartheid, like use that word when talking about Israel. That's a very important development. And I view that very much as similar to seeing this small group of U.S. athletes who are speaking out for Palestinians. I see it as connected because those are both worlds, whether you're talking about the sports cultural sphere, whether you're talking about the Democratic Party, that the Israeli state has historically depended upon for a kind of uncritical support. from the sports end, much more in a diplomatic sense, sports diplomacy and the like, which Israel has always used very effectively. And to see that break apart is a very important development and a hopeful development. And it's one of the reasons why, like for me, I mean, I'm Jewish. I'm part of the movement here. And I had several Palestinian friends who were actually very encouraged by what happened recently. And I was confused by that at first, at their optimism because of the horrific nature of the carnage. But they spoke to me about, like, all right, we're starting to see a different kind of alignment take place, where people who are anti-racist on principle around Black Lives Matter are seeing that they need to also connect around the issue of Palestinian liberation. And I view that, frankly, as Ali's legacy.
Yeah, how important do you think it is for mainstream figures, though, again, coming back to people like Kaepernick, to bring even more attention to the subject matter? Because in my opinion, a big part of the reason why the calls for Palestinian liberation have mounted in the recent year or two, in addition to the fact that the situation is just getting that much worse on the ground, but also because there have been some more high-profile people that have gone out on the limb and defended it. Obviously, having Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib in the Congress, being two Muslim women that have, championed the BDS cause, just having that high-profile institutional backing of being a congressperson, I think has done some work in furthering that cause and making it an acceptable thing to talk about. And again, I just worry that it's not going to be taken to the next level if people like Kaepernick, who are supposedly the icons of the Black Lives Matter movement, aren't going to really take a full-throated position on this. And I really call out the Biden administration and the Democratic Party for continuing the status quo.
Well, if you remember, like, it's not that Colin isn't saying anything about Palestine. He's not saying anything about just about anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I would ask you to find instances of it. I mean, he spoke out for Mumia earlier this year, which was amazing, but I can tell you that getting that done was a very difficult task. And but he's just a different kind of cat. Like, he's not Ali. He's somebody who sat during the anthem because he was furious about racism. And no one would have even known about it if a reporter hadn't gone up to him and said, "Hey, why were you sitting?" Like, it was never Kaepernick's intent to be like a public figure on these questions. So I view Colin as a very, and I view everybody, like as specific cases. And so Colin Kaepernick is trying to figure out a roadmap for how he can be most effective, given his personality, given his capacity, given all of these things. So he's got a book coming out, for example, about prison abolition. And if this book takes off, that's a conversation changer.
Oh, 100%.
So instead of just talking about, like the abolition, as you well know, the abolitionist discussion is very different than the reform discussion, very different from the, police need more sensitivity training discussion.
Yeah, speaking of Angela Davis, wrote the actual book on prison abolition, so people should
exactly. So it's politically, it's not the George Floyd policing bill. It's something entirely different, and even that isn't going to get passed. But it's something entirely different. And so that's a conversation changer. That's the space where Colin feels comfortable. And I think that's where he's going to stay until the movement's bigger. I mean, so I think our job is to build the movement and hopefully bring some of these folks along. But that's the real work right there. Can it be a game changer when some of these high profile people speak out for things like Palestine? Of course it can be a game changer. It's incredibly important. But one of the reasons why it's such a game changer is because it's so infrequent. And so we have to create the social conditions so it's more frequent. Yeah. That's our job.
I watched an old C-SPAN talk that you gave in preparation for this conversation, Dave, and it was about your book, What's My Name, Fool? And you joked about the reaction at the time being like, oh, why don't you just write a book about the great atheists of the Christian Coalition? Why not write about Strom Thurmond's favorite moments in Black history? The reaction that people gave you when you talked about the role that, progressive politics, revolutionary politics have in sports. I feel like that has changed since then. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the reaction that you get from people that you talk to when you introduce these ideas now, as opposed to maybe in the Bush era when that book came out.
It's a great question. I mean, the change is beyond dramatic. My other old joke, since you just threw out two of them. My other very old joke was, yeah, all of us sports and politics people are going to have one of our annual conventions in a phone booth, because there were so few people who wanted to talk about this stuff. And when I would go on the road and talk to folks, generally the people who had come to book talks were either there out of for curiosity purposes, or there were leftists who were or there were parents who were lefties who brought their like teenage kids who was totally into sports to try to connect with their kids. Or, I mean, it was such a hodgepodge. Or you also had the folks who were like the lefties who would sort of say to me in like a really quiet voice, like, hey man, I like sports too, but shh, don't tell anybody, you know.
Yeah.
Like treating it as if like they were passing me a note in a prison camp or something. Like, it was all very weird. And I felt very lonely in this, in the prospect of traveling around and talking about that book. That's to say that's changed. It would be like the understatement of the century. I mean, now it's its own industry. I mean, I could go through the newspapers for you, but the Washington Post, USA Today, and New York Times, they have what they call a sports and politics journalist or a sports and culture beat. Like they have now, they're developing departments at these papers to talk about sports and society. Colleges like Ohio State now have entire departments called sports sociology. So big time state schools that didn't exist in 2005. You know, the opportunities for speaking, the opportunities for writing. I mean, it's a profoundly different world. It's also a more crowded world, which isn't always great. But I much more like there being this big pool of folks, and there being podcasts, and there being columnists, and there being, you know, some websites that are taking like a very countercultural position on sports. I certainly prefer that to the alternative, which is me being alone in a bookstore in Oakland.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've so Oh, I was just going to say that I think it's really dumb that there's any resistance on the left to this idea of enjoying sports, or frankly, really enjoying anything. I've always said that, like, even if you love like reality television, just the most like degenerate content out there, like, who cares? You know, if that's what you want to spend your time doing, that's who am I to police that? You know, everyone has their own thing that they like. Everyone enjoys guilty pleasures. Like, I like slasher movies from the 80s that are ridiculous and, you know, probably pretty problematic. Like, who gives a shit? Like, what life should be about is enjoying it, not slaving away or, you know, doing whatever. So I just think it's so counterproductive, and also just a terrible look for the leftist movement or cause to be turning our nose up at a pastime that's really existed for all of human history.
Well, that's part of it too, is, and that's so important, is that sports, whether people want to hear this or not, is part of the human condition. Like, as soon as people could clothe themselves, feed themselves, shelter themselves as human beings, they socially organized themselves to play games. That's what they did. Sometimes these games were to aid in the development of war or hunting skills. Sometimes they were combat sports for fun. I mentioned combat sports because you mentioned you were a fan of combat sports. That's about the oldest sport there is. You know, this idea of for fun, like seeing how can we, you know, compete against one another. Competition is part of any society. Now, competition for profit is a whole different discussion. Competition of industry is a whole different discussion. Competition for food, for wages, for healthcare, that's a different discussion. And sports, of course, reflects our society. Sports is a reflection. It's a shaper of our society, no question about that. But first and foremost, it reflects the society in which we live. And I would argue that our current society is kind of barbaric. And so oftentimes a lot of our sports world reflects that barbarism. But there's also beauty in our society, certainly. And that beauty gets reflected itself in sports, as it does all art. Like, people who say, no sports, we need a society without sports, is to me a little bit like, and this is a real art, maybe this will be an argument, but there are people on the left who say that there should be no such thing as museums, because museums are inherently bad because they're elitist, because they're run by capitalists. And it's like, yes, they are elitist. Yes, they are run by capitalists. But that doesn't mean a museum in a more sane society could be amazing. I mean, frankly, the one thing, I live in Washington, D.C., the one thing D.C. does right is have free museums.
Great.
And you go to those museums and it's multiracial, they're working class people. I mean, it's an entirely different kind of operation than, say, going to MoMA in New York City. That's just me backing up what you're saying here. It's like sports, good. Sports under capitalism, not so good.
Right.
But
like everything, right? Under capitalism,
Really not.
right?
Yeah,
Kinda,
exactly.
you get the shit end of the stick. One last thing from me. I wanted you to share, if you could, the story of why you chose "What's My Name, Fool" to be the title of your book, and why you chose the Muhammad Ali image and that for the title of your book.
Well, I'll tell you why I chose it and what the first person who saw it at a bookstore said to me. I don't want to say the bookstore. It was an anarchist bookstore. I was doing my first talk around the book. I chose "What's My Name, Fool" and this big face of Muhammad Ali on the cover because I wanted it to sort of, make an impact, put it right in people's face. Like, yeah, sports. Yeah, Ali. Yeah, we're the left. Yeah, we're claiming this legacy. Like really loudly. And the person at the bookstore who worked at this collective, he saw the book and he looked at it and he said, "What's my name, fool?" He said, for his first question, it was hilarious. He said, "Why did you decide to write a book about Mr. T?" And I said, no. Mr. T said, "I pity the fool, not what's my name, fool." And then the next thing he said, and I got to ask you, I'm so sorry if this is offensive, but you're white. And I said, "I'm not offended. And yeah, I'm white." And he said, "But isn't that you on the cover? Isn't that supposed to be you?" And he pointed at Muhammad Ali's face. And I had to explain to him, because, the book is, I could get why he would say it, because, the book's in the first person. "What's my name, fool? Dave Zirin." And then there's this face. And he was just like, "Well, I thought that was going to be you walking into the store." And I had to explain to him. I said, "No, that's Muhammad Ali, and that's from like 1964. But other than that, we're doppelgangers."
That's funny.
Dave Zirin, thank you so much for coming on the show today. You have a new book coming out, The Kaepernick Effect.
Out in September, yes.
Me Changing the World. People can find you on Twitter at Edge of Sports, host of the Edge of Sports podcast. You're the sports editor for The Nation. Anything else that we can plug for you before you get out of here? Thank you so much for your time today.
The only thing I want to plug is my appearance on this show. So please tag me when it's up. I'll be happy to spread it all around the socials.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's awesome.
Because I really do appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, it was
so
a great
much.
Conversation.
Yeah, thanks, man. Really appreciate it. Also, just a quick shout out. My girlfriend used to fact check for you. She said you're one of the nicest people she's ever fact checked for you, and to just say what's up.
Oh my goodness. Well, please give the what's up back. Generally, I believe you treat fact checkers like shit. No, I'm just kidding. No. I think that's awesome. Without fact checkers, we'd all be sued. So
anyway,
please
take care, man.
My thanks.
Yeah. Peace.
Yeah.
Have a great night.